Welcome to Luvbites. Luvbites. By Dr. Tara, your destination for sexual wellness and mindful relationship advice. Hope you're having an orgasmic day.
Hey, loves, I'm so excited for you to learn from our guest today because today is not just an ordinary person. Today, we have the sex professor in the house. Hi, Dr. Nicole.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
Oh my gosh, I am just elated to have you on my podcast episode today. So, today we are chatting with Dr. Nicole McNichols. She's a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. And she teaches this class called Psych 210, The Diversity of Human Sexuality. I think it's so interesting that that's the class you teach. Can you tell us a little bit more about this class?
Sure. Yeah. So I started teaching this class about 8 years ago. And it now has, when I started teaching it, it only had a couple hundred students. It now has 1,200 students who take it every quarter. And it covers a really broad array of topics, everything from anatomy to sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual communication, behavior, sexual response, and, kinks, fetishes, all different types of stuff. So yeah, so it's not a required class, but it's obviously a popular one. And I love teaching it because I think that a lot of students come to college not really having had access to comprehensive sex positive sex education. And so for many of them, my class is the first time that they're really learning anything about sex. So I view it as a real honor that I get to be, I wish that they learned more about it before they came to me. I wish that there was better sex education early on, but yeah, it's really fun for me to be able to kind of, take part of that, be in that on that journey with my students as they try to learn about sex. So
That's so wonderful. And yeah, I mean, we all educators wish that our students had had this education long time ago, right? Perhaps closer to the year where they had their sexual debut or, when they were really confused and like in middle school or high school and are navigating all of this really confusing waters. So as you're teaching this class, and I'm curious, do you have a favorite unit that you teach?
Students always ask me about that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I kind of like, what I really love is sort of normalizing things, right? And trying to like explain to people that, what we think of as being normal is kind of this false construct that a lot of behaviors, first of all, exist on a continuum, and who's to say what normal is anyway.
Right.
So when I talk about, for example, kinks and BDSM, I'm always sort of, I think students are kind of always expecting that that's going to be a topic that only really applies to a small number of people who enjoy kinks and BDSM. But what they hopefully realize during that unit is that kink is something that exists on a spectrum, and all of us in one regard or another could be defined as kinky if you take a really broad definition of it.
Yeah.
And right. I mean, like if you look at power differentials and,
Yes.
the idea of one person leading and the other one following, even for people who, I don't practice kink, but I can recognize those aspects within my own, sexual repertoire. So, I think that people kind of look at that and realize, oh God, I guess there are parts of this that do resonate with me and that do help me understand myself a little bit better. So yeah, so that's a really fun chapter.
So if I like getting choked while having sex with my partner and perhaps like getting spanked, then I'm practicing like light BDSM.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say I would put choking and spanking probably at the more extreme end, actually, of BDSM.
Ooh.
Yeah, but I would say that somebody, that people assume that just to be into BDSM means that you're going to have these very extreme behaviors. But I'm saying that there can be more sort of more kind of gentle ways to, and sort of, less intense ways to start out with BDSM, like using a blindfold or using sensation play. So, so that's the goal with, that unit, but also across my whole class is just to make people realize that you don't have to, all of these concepts can apply to all of us, even if we don't
Mhm.
identify as, a certain label. So.
You were going to say another unit that you like teaching.
Oh, yes. The other unit I really like is the unit about sexual arousal and response,
Mhm.
because I feel like most students come into college having learned a lot about kind of the risks associated with sex, whether it's sexually transmitted infections
Mhm.
or unplanned pregnancy. And what we don't talk a lot about is, the celebratory side of sex and its positive aspects and how it can be
Mhm.
pleasurable. So, I like explaining, what sexual response looks like and what orgasms are like and what, looking at sort of research on sexual pleasure. So that's always really fun to look at too.
Awesome. So, as you are teaching these units in the quarter, has students told you any like interesting like TMI information that you're like, okay, I'm probably not I'm a professor, but I'm probably not a good person to be talking about this.
Well, I mean, the only thing that so first of all, so nothing is TMI. Having said that, I am not I am not an MD, right? So
Right.
I cannot help you. I don't want to give students specific advice about what kind of birth control,
Right.
right? Or what they should
Nobody has
do.
come out and be like, Dr. Nicole, can you look at this bump?
Right, exactly, exactly. Like that, I do not have. I'm not interested, nor do I have
Do not show me the bumps.
I don't want to see the bumps. Exactly, exactly. I have more, people who are more about, I enjoyed this. Is that normal? I
Mhm.
enjoyed dressing up like this during sex. Is that normal? And it's more, so it's more about, I think assuring people that yes, they are normal, that it's healthy, that as
Mhm.
long as it's not hurting you or somebody else, as long as it's consensual, that our definition of normal should be very broad. So,
Yeah, I love that. Normalizing sex and sex talk.
yeah, exactly.
I'm trying to do the same thing in my class on sexual communication, but
Uh-huh.
sexual communication at the beginning is all like the sex stuff. And then it goes more in depth in variables that are related to communication.
I
But
would love to hear more about your class, actually. Yeah. So,
it is fun
yeah.
and interesting. And it's almost very practical. Like,
Uh-huh.
here's what you say. Here are
Uh-huh.
examples, ABC. Like
Uh-huh.
dirty talk examples, ABC. And then as a class, we also come up with examples. And then throughout, coming up with examples, we all giggle and kind of normalize, like, hey, it's okay to
Uh-huh.
say these things. Like, that's
Yep.
fine.
Yeah, I love
Uh,
that.
okay, so your Instagram is, I love it. I love the
Thank you.
aesthetics. I love the info, the content. So on your IG, you talk about this is a recent post. You talk about how burnout affects relationships. And I
Yeah.
think we're in a time and age where a lot of us in our like late 20s, 30s, 40s are experiencing mad burnout.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk more about that and what we should do?
Well, I think that that's exactly right. I think that, we've been going through this pandemic for the last, over 18 months. And I think there was an article that came out in the Lancet a couple of months ago saying that, anxiety and depression rates have increased by 400% around the globe. I
Oh
mean,
gosh.
all of us are incredibly stressed out. And and we traditionally think of burnout as something that just comes from work. But I think that one thing that's happened in the last 18 months is those lines between work and home have become more blurred.
Mhm.
And I think that we're no longer just compartmentalizing like work stays at work and home stays at home. I think a lot of the emotions and energy that happens in those two domains spills over a lot.
Mhm.
So, so one thing I think people kind of need to pay attention to is just the way that stress in their lives is pouring into their relationships and, possibly even compromising them in terms of how they're relating to their partner and what the kind of sex that they're having with their partner. If you come home and you're extremely stressed and burnt out, we only have a limited amount of resources in terms of time and energy. And if all those resources are being used up worrying about COVID and worrying about your job and worrying
Mhm.
about, taking care of children or relatives, there's going to be a lot less left over to be able to pour into your relationship. Right. And
Mhm.
And so that can make people sort of have less patience, right? It really wears on your patience. So things that initially seemed maybe minorly annoying now all of a sudden seem hugely annoying. You feel kind of disconnected. You feel, a big part of burnout is, what really makes burnout different than just being depressed is this feeling of cynicism, just feeling like, well, what's the point anyway? None of this really matters anyway. And so it's almost like, well, that feeling can get transferred into feeling like, well, what's the point in trying to, connect with my partner? They're not going to understand anyway. Or what's the point in trying to invest here? It's not going to make me feel any better. It's sort of this hopelessness that happens. And, so a lot of those things can, then pour into the partner, and then it starts to impact the dynamic and the relationship between both relationship partners. And then of course pours into, their sex life. And, we've definitely evolved as human beings not to be sexual when we're stressed out, right? I mean, if we're stressed, we tend to be kind of close in on ourselves. The last thing we want to do is expand and have sex with another person. So all of those, ways of relating and coping and having sex all sort of shut down. And I think that a lot of people are struggling with that right now and are really trying to dig their way out of that, because we're almost in a place where how can you not feel a little bit about that, just with the anxiety that we all have with everything happening in the world right now.
So that's well said. So well said. So many people are saying things like, well, I'm so stressed out, or I have so much work, or there's so many chores. I don't feel like having sex. What do you say to those people? How would you advise them?
Well, I think that a lot of times that type of feeling of like, well, I don't have time. And I think that that's, really, there's sort of two different kind of situations where you can look at that as occurring, right? First of all, let's talk about what that looks like in like a relationship, right? Because a lot of times what I think couples sort of forget is that, it's, despite what the movies and, media suggest, it's not normal to just be, wanting and thinking about and ready for sex at the drop of a pin, 24/7. That's just not how most of us are wired. And there typically is a period in the beginning of a relationship where sexual intensity is quite high and where it's easy to become aroused and where you are thinking about the other person and having sex with them a lot, right? That's very normal. But over time, it kind of starts to that starts to fade a little bit. And a lot of people worry and think there's a problem in their relationship when that happens. But in fact, there's really not a problem. It's just that the nature of sexual desire is changing. And there's a great book written by Emily Nagoski named, I think it's
Come As You Are.
Come As You Are, exactly, where she describes the difference between spontaneous sexual desire versus responsive sexual desire. And the point I think that she makes in that book that's really relevant to your question is that sometimes it's, even though you might feel stressed and there might be a lot on your mind, if you can just make yourself try to be responsive to sexual stimuli, if you can just give it a chance, right? Give it, if your partner's reaching out to you, if they're expressing interest in sex, if you can just give it a chance, that what starts to happen is, although you begin not thinking that you really are dying to have sex that moment, that as things get going and your body starts to warm up to the idea that feeling, that psychological sense of sexual desire then begins to grow. And it's, and you end up really enjoying it. And, in some ways it's almost like going to the gym. If you're an exerciser, you start out thinking, oh God, I'm too tired.
Right.
I'm too stressed. I don't have time to go. But then you go and you're like, oh my God, I feel amazing. I'm so glad I did that. Now
I needed this.
I needed this. I have a refreshed mindset. Right. So it's a little bit like that. And, it's interesting because people I think it's easy to sort of misinterpret the advice that she gives in that book as saying, well, what you're doing is just telling people to have sex, even if they don't want to, right? And that's a form of coercion, but it's not a form of coercion if you, the person, are actively making the decision of, well, I may not think that I am dying for this right now, but what if I just kind of give it a chance? If I just open myself up to the possibility, right? Because I do believe that in relationships, sex is important. And I think that what happens is if you stop having sex, that the longer, it just starts to get longer and longer in between each time you have sex, that your desire will then start to decline with it. So I think it's important to prioritize it and to, I wrote a post about scheduling sex, right? I mean, I think it's good to schedule sex to make sure that you are having sex with your partner, because there's a lot of connection that occurs, when you have, look, sex is amazing for you from like a physical perspective, but it also psychologically connects you to your partner in a really special way. And I think that that's something that, ironically, if we're telling ourselves, oh, I don't have time to have sex because I'm too stressed out, actually, we're stressed out. Therefore, we should be having more sex as a way of coping.
Hallelujah, sister.
Right? Hallelujah.
You're preaching to the choir. I am listening and like furiously nodding.
Oh, good. I love it.
Yeah. So I love that. And it makes me sad that some people read that part and may take your advice about like, you should have sex anyways as a negative thing, because people get so defensive when they don't want to do something, right? Exactly. And you are telling these people that are already, perhaps in a negative mindset about their relationship and about sex, you're telling them to do what they don't want to do. They get super defensive. Like, oh, so you're saying I should be forcing myself to do these things? Right. Like, no, calm down. Exactly. What we're saying is sex itself can serve as a sexual desire stimulant.
Yes.
Right? It like re-stimulates you. If you haven't had sex a long time, and some people come to me and said, we haven't had sex 2 years. I can't even imagine. What is that like?
I know.
And like, what does that do to the relationship and the connection and really to the individuals in that relationship? Like, do they feel sexy? Do they feel attractive?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think I read someplace, it's actually even similar to water, right? If you don't drink a lot of water, right, over time, you start to like not be as thirsty, even though you're walking around being wildly dehydrated, you've sort of lost your.
I'm like imagining other parts of the body being wildly dehydrated.
Exactly. Right. So it's like if you have, or if you look at infants with sleeping, right? And I know that we don't want to draw in children in a conversation about sex, but sleep is important. The more if you are really, really sleep deprived, right? It's harder to fall asleep, right? If you are really, really haven't had sex in a long time, you're going to lose that desire for sex. Like it's just how our bodies adapt. And so, so I think it's really important to push yourself a little bit. I mean, look, if you really don't want to have sex, or if you're really not attracted to your partner, then those are separate issues, which should, by the way,
that's a different problem.
That's like a different problem, right? But to the extent that you can, I do think you should prioritize and try to have sex when, and fit it in ways that you can, because otherwise I think that your mental health and your relationship will suffer.
All right. 1,000 snaps for that, Dr. Nicole. So, you were talking a little bit about like how if you're not attracted to your partner, then that's a different problem. What do you think are some ways, just based on what you're teaching and the research out there, what are some ways people can recognize like listen, you're not attracted to your partner?
Well, I mean, I think that here's the thing. If you began the relationship really attracted to your partner, and then you find yourself in the relationship then losing attraction for your partner, it probably has nothing to do with any kind of physical aspect of them. It probably has more to do with the dynamics of, unless your partner, I don't know, has gone through some massive physical transformation, right? It probably has more to do with the relationship dynamics. And so it probably has to do with a lack of communication, right? It might have to do with the fact that you're having sex and that you are embarrassed to talk about what feels good to you, and you're embarrassed to ask for what you want in bed, and you're embarrassed to ask, if you don't have good sexual communication, you're not going to have good sex, and no one's going to no one wants bad sex, right? Of course, you're going to lose your desire for sex if the sex you're having isn't very good. Right. So there's that. But then there are also, you can't dismiss just the relationship dynamics, right? So if you're feeling like you're not appreciated by your partner, if you feel like that you're not being respected, if you feel like you don't trust your partner, like maybe they're, cheating on you, or maybe they're not as invested and you feel like they don't care about you as much as it seemed like in the beginning, that is absolutely going to start to divide you from your partner, make you feel not as close. And that will pour into your sort of lack of desire to have sex with them as a consequence.
Right. Yeah. Like less attracted to them because of all these things combined, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Are there actual signs that you're not like psychologically a good match?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And
I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really has to be kind of this, on the one hand, it's this in the moment feeling, right? Like when you're around them, are you happy? When you're around them, are you having fun? Right. I mean, those are sort of the most important questions.
And those are like the natural, like chemistry. Either you have it or you don't, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. But what I also sort of warn people about is sometimes people worry that if it's not like fireworks in the very beginning, that there's something wrong and that there's like not enough chemistry. And that's a mistake, right? That's kind of like this script that gets fed into us from the movies that, we're supposed to just be like dying for the person the first time we meet them. Sometimes when you experience that kind of wild chemistry right in the beginning, it's not so much that you're a perfect match for them. It's more that they're triggering some kind of unresolved attachment issue that you had with probably a parent or caregiver, right? So, for example, if you had a caregiver who was maybe not the most emotionally giving person when you were a child, then when you meet somebody and they kind of seem like they're into you, but they're a little bit distant and aloof, that's to you is going to feel like, oh, wow, this person is really, this is a match for me.
Oh gosh.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like things that to many of us might feel, and we might describe as being like a red flag, like somebody who's like emotionally distant or who doesn't really act like your concerns come first, right? Somebody like that, if that's what you grew up with, that's what feels familiar. And if it feels familiar, that's going to be what feels like it's right and a good match. So I think you've got to be really careful when you're sort of assessing that early on chemistry to think, well, is this person really good for me? Or is it just reminding me of how I felt, from a past relationship? And it's just familiarity that feels good. Because I think some of the best relationships aren't necessarily, sometimes the relationships that begin with fireworks kind of end with fireworks too. Some of the best relationships really, I think, begin with more of a slow burn that's a little bit more enduring. And it may not be as exciting in the very beginning, but it's more authentic and it's more real and it's going to be longer lasting. So I think I think you have to just kind of pay attention to what is in, what kind of reaction your body is making in the moment and not to overanalyze it too much. Right. So not to kind of be having this like checklist of things that you want and looking at a person and trying to compare them constantly to that checklist. That's generally not a good idea.
Right. Yeah. Doesn't seem too natural.
Right. Exactly.
So my last question for you is for everyone that's listening, even if you're in your 20s or 30s, 40s, some people are going to have children. Some people already have children. I'm always curious in terms of talking about sex to kids and preteens and teens. What are some of your advice about that?
Yeah, well, so I think that the more information, the better, the more, but I think a lot of it also is about modeling comfort around sex, right? So for example, I think it's really important to teach children about what healthy relationships look like, right? And so that means that, you are, you enforce values about what it's like to be kind and to care about another person's feelings. And you also model that with the people in your own life, right? Like with your husband or wife or relationship partner. And then I think it's, in terms of like I think it's really important, for example, from like the very beginning to label body parts correctly and not to use made up words, because that just teaches a child that those body parts are shameful when they shouldn't be doing that.
Like,
And
oh, this is a flower. Like,
right,
you,
exactly.
when do
Like,
you think it's not too early to say like vulva
I
or
think you should say
penis?
vulva from and penis from like birth. I mean, I think that
Mm-hmm.
those words,
Mm-hmm.
like right from the very beginning, should be used because they shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, there's this idea that it's shameful. And
Right.
there's this idea that, oh, well, if you can't say them out loud, then, you know, that then they're shameful and they're hidden. And then it's also kind of almost, keeping knowledge away from a child, which is
Mm-hmm.
really just disempowering, right? What you want to be doing is
Mm-hmm.
empowering a child so they have all the information, because otherwise they're just going to learn about it from friends and they're going to learn about it from online porn.
Mm-hmm.
That's not where you want them to learn about it, right? That's just going to
Mm-hmm.
give them kind of false ideas of what bodies and sex look like that are not going to work in their favor.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I always encourage using the right labels, and then, teaching them, just really straightforward, how are babies made? Well, a sperm from the daddy and an egg from the mommy come together and form a baby, and is in the uterus, which is the bottom of the tummy in the mommy, right? I mean, I think you can kind of make it direct. And then in terms of actually discussing, the mechanics of sex, I think all of these can also follow the child's lead, right? And just
Mm-hmm.
seeing, it's rather than there being one giant sex talk that you just kind of like dump on the child at a certain
Mm-hmm.
age, that these conversations kind of be sprinkled throughout their childhood.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah. And then, the other thing I also tell people is, what the research clearly shows is that children are not harmed. In fact, they're helped by seeing their parents naked. So you
Mm-hmm.
don't need to, hide your body if you're getting in and out of the shower.
Ooh.
Totally fine to let it all hang out. It's children will learn to be sort of more accepting and less ashamed of their own bodies if they see that you kind of feel the same way. So,
Ooh, my future children shall
yeah,
see me naked all the time.
all the time. Great.
I love that. So, studies show that parents rarely talk about sex to their kids. And if they do, the age range is from 11 to 17. What do
Yeah.
you think is like a good age to have, like, I like the way you describe it. Like, you should show it through modeling and adding like vocabulary and language throughout their
Yeah.
childhood. But like,
Yeah.
when's a good time to have like a full conversation, like a sit down, like, hey, listen, I feel like you're going to be sexually active soon, or maybe you are. Like, when should this happen and what should this conversation entail?
Well, I think, I mean, again, as much as you can like take the pressure off of it just being one conversation, I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's good. I mean, I do think, for example, right as children are starting to go through puberty, for example, is a good
Mm-hmm.
time to like have a conversation about puberty. And, I think that children should know about like the mechanics of sex from, as early as age 6 to 8. I mean, it's okay
Mm-hmm.
for a 6 to 8-year-old to understand that for a baby to be made, a penis goes inside of a vagina.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think that that's good to know early on. But I think in terms of things like, consent, for example, and making sure
Mm-hmm.
that consent is given and making sure that you're advocating for yourself. I think, again, like around 11, 12, when kids
Mm-hmm.
are, you want to have the conversation right before they're starting to be sexually active so that they have that, so that they're, you don't want them to look at you like you're an alien.
Right.
Right? Like you're talking about things that they just have no idea what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But you also don't want to wait so long that they just, you've kind of missed the boat and they've already sort of,
Right.
gotten this information from, friends or the internet, which is not ideal.
Yeah, like, mom, listen, I already learned all of that from porn.
Right, exactly. It's like, well, let's talk about why
So
porn is maybe not the
scary.
most realistic idea. Yeah.
Wow. Yes, that's all so interesting. And I will be thinking about that as, my future children come alive and thinking about having a conversation throughout and having a more serious conversation before puberty. I think that's super interesting and helpful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank
What would be your last words? Like, tips, advice, just last
you.
words.
I would say, stop comparing yourself to ideals that or ideas and scripts that you have running in your head about what sex and bodies should look and relationships should look like. Appreciate yourself for who you are, appreciate your partner for who they are, and, accept that sex has a lot to offer us and that there's not just one definition of what's normal. So.
Oh, I love it. Sex
Thank
has
you.
a lot to offer us, and not one definition is normal. Oh my gosh, I love, love, love that. Thank you so much for your
Yeah,
time.
my
I'd like
pleasure.
to move forward to our little game segment.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, so this is 10 Quickies with Dr. Tara, and this is Dr. Nicole. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. 1, swinging.
Rope.
2, 2, G-spot.
Vibrator.
3, choking.
Choking. Whip.
4, squirting.
Ejaculation.
5, 5, lube.
Flavor.
6, S&M.
Rihanna.
Ooh, love that song.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Riri, come on my podcast. 7, pegging.
Go for it.
8, orgy.
Fun.
Woo! 9, polyamorous relationships.
Ethical.
Nice. And then last but not least, 10, butt plugs.
Novelty.
Love it, love it, love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Nicole. And for those of you that want to follow Dr. Nicole on Instagram, I will have the link into this show's description. But do you want to plug in your Instagram?
I would love for you to follow my Instagram. It's Nicole, the sex professor. And come follow me. And I love sharing ideas and tips and just things I think are funny. So thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Nicole. And thanks, y'all, for listening. Have an orgasmic day.
Thanks for listening. This was Love Bites.
Love Bites.
By Dr. Tara. Follow Dr. Tara on social media at lovebites.co. Have an orgasmic day.